The voice on the speaker crackled, a ghost swallowed by a hurricane of static. Wraith 1 is compromised. I say again, compromised. Vipers in the wire. We are pinned. LZ is no-go, taking heavy. The transmission dissolved into a high-pitched squeal, then silence. On the central holographic map in the Tactical Operations Center, the 6 green icons of Wraith Team were blinking red, clustered inside a crumbling adobe compound deep in the Alcarat mountain range. A larger, angrier red mass pulsed around them, representing an enemy force 10 times their size. But the most formidable enemy was the storm. A sprawling supercell, a swirling vortex of green, yellow, and blood red, was descending upon the entire sector. It had already grounded every F-22 and AC-130 in a 500-mile radius. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before the map, his jaw a granite slab of frustration. He was a man built of regulations and straight lines, and this entire situation was a chaotic, asymmetric mess. "What's the official weather report?" he barked, not looking at anyone in particular. A young lieutenant, voice tight with nerves, read from a screen. "Sir, meteorological reports categorize it as a severe cyclonic event. Wind shear at 200 knots, zero visibility, hail the size of golf balls. They're calling it a generational storm. Nothing can fly." "Nothing," Thorne repeated, the word a death sentence. He looked at the blinking red icons. 6 men, the best he had, lost because a simple recon mission had turned into an ambush, and God himself had decided to throw a tantrum. He swept his gaze across the assembled staff officers, their faces grim and impotent. They were planners, logisticians, intelligence analysts. They could move mountains on paper, but they couldn't move a single helicopter through that wall of black fury on the screen. His eyes passed over a figure standing near the back, half hidden in the shadows cast by the flickering displays. Major Eva Rostova. She wasn't part of his command staff. She was a transient pilot, grounded by a minor hydraulic issue on her transport flight, now stuck on his forward operating base until the storm passed. She was just another piece of administrative baggage he had to deal with. She stood perfectly still, her posture economical, her gaze fixed not on the panicked faces in the room, but on the topographical data beneath the storm overlay. She was watching the shape of the land, the contours of the canyons, as if reading a language no one else could see. Thorne dismissed her from his thoughts. She was irrelevant, a ghost at a funeral. "Get me CENTCOM," Thorne commanded, turning his back on the map. "I need to prepare the notification protocols. We'll authorize a recovery mission as soon as this storm breaks." "Sir," the lieutenant stammered, "that could be 12, maybe 16 hours. Thorne's glare could cut steel. "I am aware of the timeline, Lieutenant. Do you have a weather-defying miracle in your pocket?" The room fell into a heavy, defeated silence. The only sound was the faint, desperate crackle from the speaker, a sound like dying embers. Outside, the first gust of wind howled against the reinforced walls of the TOC, a predator announcing its arrival. For the men of Wraith Team, the clock wasn't just ticking. It had already run out, and in the corner, Major Rostova shifted her weight, a subtle movement of decision, her eyes tracing a line through an impossible canyon on the map, a path that, to every other pilot on Earth, did not exist. Colonel Thorne paced before the holographic display, the red icons of Wraith Team now blinking with a desperate, frantic rhythm. He had spent the last 20 minutes listening to every expert, every meteorologist, every seasoned flight operations officer on the base. The consensus was absolute, a monolithic wall of professional certainty. Any attempt to fly into that maelstrom was not a risk. It was a suicide pact. The air itself had become a meat grinder. "The barometric pressure is dropping at a rate we've never seen," the weather officer said, his face pale. "The updrafts and downdrafts are creating vertical wind shear that would tear the rotors off a standard Black Hawk. It's not just the rain and hail, sir. The air isn't stable enough to support flight." Thorne nodded grimly. "Understood," he turned to the assembled officers. "Our hands are tied. We wait for a break in the weather. That's final." A quiet voice cut through the tense atmosphere. There is a way. Every head turned. Major Eva Rostova had stepped out of the shadows. Her flight suit was immaculate but worn. The fabric faded over the shoulders and knees. She carried no rank insignia on her chest, only a simple leather name patch that read, Rostova. She moved with a liquid economy, her presence unassuming until she spoke. Now, the entire room's attention was a physical weight upon her. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Major, you have something to add. His tone was laced with impatience, the kind a senior officer reserves for an unwelcome interruption from a subordinate outside his chain of command. The Al-Karat range creates a unique thermal dynamic, Rostova stated, her voice calm and even, betraying no deference or fear. She pointed a steady finger at the holographic map. This main canyon, the Serpent's Tooth, will act as a funnel. The storm's velocity will increase through the passage, but its core temperature will collide with the colder, denser air trapped at the canyon floor. It will create a narrow thermal inversion layer, maybe 50 feet thick. It won't be stable, but it will be flyable. A ripple of disbelief went through the room. The flight ops officer, a major with 20 years of experience, scoffed audibly. Sir, with all due respect to the major, that's a textbook theory. In a storm of this magnitude, any such layer would be shredded by turbulence. It's academic fantasy. Thorne crossed his arms, his expression hardening into a mask of dismissal. And I suppose you intend to fly your academic fantasy into that canyon, Major? Yes, sir, Rostova replied, without a flicker of hesitation. The colonel took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. I have 2 decades of command experience, Major. I have buried pilots who thought they were better than the weather. I will not send a crew to their deaths on a 1-in-a-million long shot based on a meteorological ghost story. Your input is noted, and it is dismissed. We are done here. He turned his back on her. A clear signal that the conversation was over. The other officers followed his lead, turning away, their body language closing her out. She was an outsider, a transient, and her proposal was the talk of a madwoman. Rostova didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or plead her case. She simply held his gaze for a moment, her own eyes dark and unreadable. Then, she gave a short, precise nod that was not an admission of defeat, but an acknowledgement of his position. She turned and walked out of the Tactical Operations Center, the heavy door hissing shut behind her. She left behind a room full of men resigned to failure, their rigid adherence to protocol a cage they had built for themselves. She, however, was not caged. She was heading for the hangar, her flight plan already spooling through her mind. Not a fantasy, but a complex, terrifying equation she was born to solve. The wind howled across the flight line, a physical force that shoved and tore at everything not bolted down. Sheets of rain, hard as pellets, lashed the hangar doors. Inside, the cavernous space was a sanctuary of relative calm, filled with the smell of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and cold steel. Under the lonely glow of the maintenance lights sat a UH-60M Black Hawk, darker than the shadows around it. Its matte black skin was scarred and patched, each imperfection a story. This was not a pristine machine from the factory floor. It was a veteran. Major Eva Rostova walked toward it, her boots echoing on the polished concrete. Waiting for her by the cockpit door was Sergeant Ben Carter, a crew chief whose youth was contradicted by the old man weariness in his eyes. He held a steaming mug in one hand and a heavy-duty torque wrench in the other. He didn't need to be told. He knew her. He had been her crew chief for 3 years, following her from one quiet, unglamorous posting to another. He knew the look in her eye. Heard the colonel grounded everyone, Carter said. His voice a low rumble that was easily heard over the rising storm. He didn't ask if she was going to obey. The colonel is a good commander, Rostova replied, her voice neutral. He makes decisions based on the data he's given. She ran a gloved hand along the helicopter's fuselage, a gesture that was both an inspection and a caress. But he doesn't have all the data. Carter nodded, understanding the distinction. He had seen her fly in sandstorms that peeled paint from metal, in mountain blizzards that made other pilots weep. He knew her data came from a different source. "She's ready," he said. "Topped off the internal auxiliaries. The de-icing systems are triple-checked. I even rerouted the pitot heaters to a redundant circuit, just in case he knew the kind of flight this would be." Rostova began her pre-flight check, a ritual she performed with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Her movements were precise, economical, honed by thousands of hours. She didn't just look at the rotor blades. She felt the composite material, searching for microfractures. She didn't just check the fuel lines. She traced their path, visualizing the flow. As she rounded the nose of the aircraft, she paused. Just beneath the pilot's side window, almost invisible against the non-reflective paint, was a small, faded emblem. It was an owl, its wings swept back for a silent dive, its eyes two piercing circles of a slightly lighter gray. It was the only personal marking on the entire aircraft. Her father, a test pilot who flew experimental craft in the high desert, had painted it on his first jet. He told her the owl sees what others cannot, hunts when others sleep. It was her lineage, her creed. She swung herself up into the cockpit, the familiar scent of worn leather and electronics enveloping her. The cockpit was her domain. It was Spartan, functional, but subtly customized. The standard cyclic grip had been replaced with one molded to her hand. A small, analog attitude indicator was mounted next to the advanced glass displays, a relic, a backup for when the electrons failed and only instinct remained. Carter was already in the co-pilot's seat, strapping in, his movements mirroring hers. He wasn't her assigned co-pilot, but he was the only one she would take into this. He knew the aircraft's soul as well as she did. "Are the door guns mounted?" she asked, her voice calm as she began flipping switches, bringing the machine to life, the cockpit filled with the low hum of avionics. "Twin M134S, Carter confirmed. "Full cans. Just in case you find what you're looking for." Rostova offered a rare, thin smile. "I always do with a final sequence of commands." The twin General Electric T-700 engines spooled up, their whine escalating into a roar that defied the storm outside. The massive, four-bladed rotor began to turn, slowly at first, then faster until it was a blurred, powerful disk. She was no longer just Major Rostova. She was an extension of this machine, a ghost preparing to ride the storm. The hangar doors groaned open, revealing a wall of horizontal rain and shrieking wind. The Tactical Operations Center erupted in a flurry of motion. "Sir, unidentified takeoff from the north ramp," an air traffic controller yelled, his voice tight with alarm. "It's a Black Hawk, sir." Squawking rogue. Colonel Thorne spun around, his face a thundercloud of fury. He strode to the main screen, watching the single, unauthorized icon lift off the map and turn directly toward the angriest, reddest part of the storm front. "Who in the hell is that? Get me their call sign. I want that pilot's name." "No call sign registered, sir," the controller replied, his fingers flying across his console. "But the transponder code. It's a transient bird. Maintenance logs show it's assigned to a Major Rostova." "Rostova?" Thorne spat the name like a curse. He grabbed the comms microphone, his knuckles white. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Colonel Thorne. You are in direct violation of a grounding order. Return to base immediately. I repeat, land your aircraft now." The only reply was the hiss of static. The icon on the map didn't deviate. It continued its inexorable path toward the tempest. Inside the cockpit of Styx, the world dissolved into chaos. The moment they cleared the relative shelter of the airbase, the storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The Black Hawk shuddered violently, thrown sideways by a gust of wind that felt like a giant's hand. Hail hammered against the armored windscreen, a deafening drum roll that threatened to shatter the glass. On the multifunction displays, alarms blared, wind shear warnings, altitude deviations, pitot heat failures. The synthetic voice of the onboard computer became a frantic, repetitive mantra of imminent danger. Rostova ignored it all. Her eyes were not on the screaming digital displays but on the small analog attitude indicator, its simple crossbar a point of stability in a world gone mad. Her hands on the cyclic and collective were fluid, making thousands of micro-adjustments per second. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was dancing with it. She felt the updrafts before they hit, easing off the collective to prevent the rotors from overspeeding. She sensed the downdrafts, pulling power just in time to avoid being slammed into the ground. Entering the canyon mouth, Carter yelled over the intercom, his own hands braced against the console. Through the sheets of rain, the dark, jagged cliffs of the Serpent's Tooth loomed like colossal fangs. This was the crux, the moment her theory met reality. As they flew between the rock walls, the ride grew impossibly violent. The helicopter bucked and yawed, the rotor blades groaning under the strain. Thorne's voice, tinny and distant, crackled in her headset again. "Major, I am ordering you to turn back. That is a direct order." Rostova keyed her mic for the first time. Her voice was unervingly calm, a sliver of ice in the heart of the inferno. "Negative, Colonel. I have the thermal layer." She pushed the cyclic forward, dropping the Black Hawk another 50 feet. And then, suddenly, the violent bucking eased. It didn't stop, but it changed. The chaotic, multi-directional turbulence was replaced by a powerful, linear force. They were in a river of air, a high-speed current flowing through the canyon. The hail lessened. The visibility improved from 0 to a few hundred feet of swirling gray mist. On the ground, the temperature gauge spiked 10 degrees. The thermal inversion was real. She had found it. In the TOC, the flight ops officer stared at his screen, his mouth agape. "Sir, look at her ground speed. It's over 200 knots. The tailwind in that canyon. It's acting like a jet stream. She's riding it." Thorne stood frozen, the microphone clutched in his hand. He had given a direct order. It had been ignored. And the pilot who ignored it was now flying an impossible aircraft through an impossible storm, on a trajectory that was taking her straight to his dying men. His rage was warring with a terrifying, nascent flicker of awe. He was witnessing either the greatest act of insubordination he had ever seen, or the greatest feat of aviation. On the ground, desperation had a taste. It was the metallic tang of blood, the grit of dust and cordite on the tongue. Captain Even, callsign Wraith 1, lay pressed against the crumbling mud wall of the compound, a fresh compression bandage on his leg staining his multicam trousers a dark, ugly crimson. His 5 remaining men were arrayed around him, their movements economical, their shots carefully placed. They were out of grenades, low on water, and down to their last 2 magazines each. The enemy, a well-armed local militia, knew it. They were no longer launching full-scale assaults. They were tightening the noose, content to wait them out, peppering their position with machine gun fire and potshots. "Anything?" Even grunted to his comm specialist, a young sergeant named Diaz. Diaz shook his head, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Just static, Cap. The storm's eating everything." He looked up at the sky, a bruised, churning ceiling of black and gray. The wind was a physical presence, moaning through the broken archways of the compound. Rain fell in thick, relentless sheets. Survival was no longer measured in hours, but in minutes. The next coordinated rush would be their last. Then, through the cacophony of the storm and the sporadic crackle of enemy gunfire, came a new sound. It was low, rhythmic, a deep thumping that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "What is that?" one of the men asked, his voice raw. "Thunder." Even tilted his head, listening. It wasn't thunder. Thunder was a crack and a rumble. This was different. It was a pulse, a heartbeat. He'd heard it 1,000 times before, in the violent skies over a dozen different countries. But it couldn't be. Not here. Not now. "No," he whispered, a sliver of disbelief warring with a sudden, impossible hope. "That's a rotor." The enemy fighters heard it too. The random potshots ceased. A confused chatter rose from their positions. They scanned the sky, but there was nothing to see but the roiling, opaque clouds. The thumping grew louder, closer, a monstrous heartbeat in the throat of the storm. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, an omnipresent, terrifying sound. And then it was there, like a phantom emerging from the netherworld, The Black Hawk materialized out of the gray wall of rain. It wasn't flying high. Its skids were no more than 20 feet above the pockmarked courtyard of the compound. It moved with an eerie, preternatural stability, holding its position against the gale-force winds as if anchored to the very air itself. Rain sluiced off its dark, scarred fuselage. It was the most beautiful thing Captain even had ever seen. For a moment, everyone, Wraith team and the enemy militia alike, was frozen in stunned silence. A helicopter. Here. It was a violation of the laws of nature. The militia fighters stared, their rifles lowered, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. Their ambush was perfect, guaranteed by the apocalyptic weather. The spell was broken by the helicopter itself. The side doors slid open, revealing the silhouettes of two-door gunners behind their miniguns. The arrival had been the first action. The second was about to begin. The sudden, profound shift in their reality was palpable. 5 minutes ago, they were ghosts waiting to die. Now they had a guardian angel, a heavily armed, impossibly skilled angel that had just descended from a heaven no one believed could be breached. Their fight wasn't over, but the certainty of their doom had been shattered. The enemy's shock lasted for precisely 12 seconds. Then their training, or perhaps their survival instinct, kicked in. The sight of the Black Hawk, a symbol of American military power, transformed their confusion into a focused, fanatical rage. A commander's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the wind, barking orders in Pashto. The scattered potshots erupted into a coordinated volley of fire. AK-47 rounds pinged and sparked against the helicopter's armored skin. The heavier thud of a DSHK heavy machine gun joined the chorus, its tracer rounds zipping through the rain-soaked air like angry red hornets. "They're focusing fire. RPG." Carter's voice was tense but steady over the intercom as he swiveled his minigun toward a fighter scrambling onto a nearby rooftop. In the TOC, the screens monitoring the situation lit up with new threat indicators. Multiple small arms, at least one heavy machine gun, and I'm tracking an RPG team moving to flank their position, an analyst called out. The bird is drawing all their fire. Colonel Thorne leaned forward, his eyes locked on the tactical display. The lone icon of Rostova's helicopter was now the epicenter of a furious storm of enemy activity. His anger at her insubordination had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, professional focus. She had made her move. Now she was in the crucible. "Rostova," he said into his mic, his voice clipped and all business. "Wraith 1 reports the heaviest contact is from the east, a fortified 2-story building. The HMG is on the roof." "Acknowledged." Rostova's voice came back, still unervingly calm. There was no panic, no strain, just a simple confirmation. She didn't try to pull away or gain altitude. Instead, she did the opposite. She dropped the Black Hawk another 10 feet, using the compound's own crumbling walls as partial cover. It was a gutsy, high-risk maneuver that put her squarely in the kill zone but also shielded her from some of the incoming fire. The thud of rounds hitting the fuselage became a constant, percussive rhythm. A warning light flashed on her console, hydraulic pressure fluctuating in a non-critical system. She registered it, dismissed it, and continued to fly. The RPG team on the rooftop lined up their shot. A trail of smoke and flame shot toward the hovering helicopter. "RPG. 3 o'clock, Carter yelled. Rostova didn't even seem to look. She had felt the shift in airflow, seen the flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. With a deft movement of the cyclic, she slid the Black Hawk 10 feet to the left. The rocket-propelled grenade screamed through the space the aircraft had occupied a microsecond earlier, impacting harmlessly against the far canyon wall in a bloom of fire and rock dust. On the ground, Captain Even and his team used the distraction to their advantage. "Suppressive fire on the HMG. Go!" he ordered. They laid down a volley of controlled bursts, forcing the heavy gunner to duck. But they knew it was a temporary solution. They couldn't get to the extraction point with that gun still active. It commanded the only open ground between them and the helicopter. In the TOC, Thorn watched the tactical ballet unfold. He was no longer just an observer. He was becoming a participant. Rostova, I can feed you real-time satellite thermal imaging, but the storm is causing significant data lag. Unnecessary, Colonel, she replied. I can see them. Thorn felt a chill. Through that storm, through that rain, she could see them? He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just dealing with a skilled pilot. He was dealing with something else entirely. His role had shifted. He had started as her jailer, then her antagonist. Now, he was her ground controller, his entire command's resources suddenly and irrevocably placed in service of her impossible flight. The doubt that had defined him just an hour ago was being systematically dismantled, shot to pieces by the reality of what he was witnessing. The DSHK on the roof was the linchpin of the enemy's defense. It had the helicopter pinned, preventing it from getting closer to Wraith's position and stopping the soldiers from breaking cover. A conventional gun run was impossible. The swirling winds in the confined courtyard made a stable firing platform a fantasy, and the risk of hitting Wraith's position was too high. The militia knew this. They felt secure on their rooftop perch, protected by the very storm that made their position so dominant. Rostova saw the tactical problem with absolute clarity. It was a geometry problem, a question of angles and energy, and it required a solution that wasn't in any flight manual. Carter, strap in tight, she said over the intercom, her voice dropping a half-octave. I'm going over the top. Carter didn't question it. He just gripped his harness and braced himself. In the TOC, Thorn saw her icon begin to move. What's she doing? She's climbing, but she's moving toward the cliff face. Rostova pushed the collective, urging the engines to their limit. The Black Hawk surged upward, not away from the fight, but directly toward the sheer rock wall that formed the eastern side of the canyon. The wind, which had been a chaotic enemy, now became her tool. She felt the powerful updraft that clung to the cliff, a river of rising air created by the storm being forced over the mountain ridge. She angled the nose up, letting the updraft catch the massive rotor disc like a sail. The helicopter climbed with unnatural speed, clawing its way up the vertical rock face. For the enemy gunner on the roof, the Black Hawk simply vanished. One moment it was there, hovering behind the compound walls. The next it was gone. He grinned, thinking he had scared it off. He swiveled the heavy machine gun back toward the courtyard, preparing to finish off the trapped soldiers. He never saw it coming. High above, Rostova reached the peak of her ascent, just cresting the canyon ridge. For a dizzying second, they were exposed to the full, unholy fury of the supercell. The helicopter was slammed by a crosswind that threw them nearly sideways. But it was all part of the calculation. As the wind pushed them, Rostova kicked the left rudder pedal hard and dropped the collective. The Black Hawk pivoted on a dime, its nose dropping violently. They were no longer climbing. They were falling, using the storm's own downdraft on the other side of the ridge to slingshot them back down. They descended almost vertically, a black predator diving out of the storm's heart. From the perspective of the door gunners, the ground rushed up at a terrifying rate. They came down directly on top of the two-story building. For a brief, shocking moment, they were level with the rooftop HMG nest, not 50 feet away. The gunner's face, a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, was clearly visible. Time seemed to slow. Rostova held the helicopter in a perfect, momentary hover, a hummingbird of death. Guns free, she said calmly. The twin M134 miniguns erupted. The sound was not a series of gunshots, but a single, deafening canvas-ripping roar as 12,000 rounds per minute tore through the air. The rooftop emplacement disintegrated. The heavy machine gun, the sandbags, the fighters manning it. All were erased in a 2-second burst of overwhelming violence. The threat was neutralized. The linchpin was broken. In the TOC, Thorn and his staff could only stare at the screen, speechless. They had just witnessed a maneuver that defied their understanding of aerodynamics and tactical doctrine. It was impossible, and it had just happened. With the rooftop machine gun silenced, the tide of the battle turned instantly. The remaining enemy fighters, their primary heavy weapon gone, and their morale shattered by the ghostly helicopter's impossible reappearance, began to fall back. Their fire became sporadic, panicked. They were no longer fighting a trapped, dying enemy. They were facing a monster that rode the storm. Wraith 1, this is Styx. Your path is clear. Pop smoke on my position. Rostova's voice, a beacon of calm in the chaos, came over Captain Evan's radio. Styx, you're a damn ghost. Even breathed, a grin splitting his grimy face. Popping green, he threw a smoke grenade, which hissed to life, its thick emerald plume immediately whipped and torn apart by the rotor wash and the wind. Rostova didn't land. The ground was too uneven, too treacherous. Instead, she brought the Black Hawk into a low, rock-steady hover, her skids just feet from the ground, the side doors perfectly aligned with the breach in the compound wall. It was a masterclass in precision flying, holding a 17,000-pound machine perfectly still against a 50-knot wind. Let's go. Move, 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 Evan yelled, getting to his feet and ignoring the searing pain in his leg. The extraction was a blur of controlled violence. Two of his men laid down a continuous curtain of suppressive fire while the others moved toward the helicopter. Carter and the other door gunner did the same, their miniguns spitting fire at any enemy fighter foolish enough to show his head. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and ozone, a symphony of roaring engines, screaming wind, and gunfire. Diaz, the comm specialist, was the last to fall back, providing cover for Evan. As the captain limped toward the waiting helicopter, a stray round caught Diaz in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the mud. "Man down!" Carter yelled from the doorway. Without hesitation, one of the other Wraith operators, a burly breacher named Stone, jumped back out of the helicopter and sprinted to Diaz's side. He hauled the younger soldier to his feet and began dragging him toward safety. The enemy, seeing their chance, concentrated their fire on the two exposed men. "Hold her steady," Carter shouted into his headset. Rostova didn't need to be told. The Black Hawk didn't budge an inch. Rounds stitched across the belly and side of the aircraft, and another warning light screamed to life on her console. Transmission fluid temperature climbing into the red. She could feel the aircraft straining, the engines whining as they fought to maintain power. She held her position. She would not leave them. Stone and the wounded Diaz tumbled into the cabin, pulled aboard by Carter and the rest of the team. "We're all in. Go!" Carter roared, slamming the door shut. Rostova didn't need a second invitation. She pulled hard on the collective, and the Black Hawk leaped into the air, ascending back into the gray, churning chaos of the storm. As they climbed, Captain Evan, leaning against the bulkhead and breathing heavily, looked out the small porthole window. He saw the enemy fighters emerging from cover, firing uselessly into the sky at the ghost that had stolen their victory. They had been beaten not by a team of soldiers, but by a single pilot and her impossible machine. He didn't know who was flying, but he knew he owed them his life and the lives of all his men. The return flight was a tense, brutal affair. The Black Hawk, now riddled with bullet holes and nursing a wounded transmission, fought its way back through the Serpent's Tooth Canyon. The thermal layer was still there, but the storm seemed to rage with even greater fury, as if angered by their trespass. Rostova flew with a surgeon's focus, her entire being concentrated on keeping the grievously injured aircraft in the air. The transmission temperature warning shrieked relentlessly, but she coaxed the machine onward, managing power and airflow with an instinct that bordered on supernatural. When they finally broke through the storm wall and the battered airbase came into view, a collective sigh of relief went through the cabin. The landing was rough but controlled. The moment the skids touched the tarmac, Rostova began the shutdown sequence, the groaning engines and rotors spinning down with a final weary sigh. The silence that followed was profound. The ground crew, who had been watching the rogue icon on their screens with a mixture of terror and disbelief, rushed toward the helicopter. They stopped short, their faces etched with awe at the state of the machine. It was a wreck. The fuselage was peppered with dozens of bullet holes. One of the main rotor blades had a chunk taken out of it. Hydraulic fluid leaked from a ruptured line, pooling on the concrete. The cabin door slid open, and the men of Wraith Team emerged, battered, bleeding, but alive. Colonel Thorne was waiting for them, his uniform soaked from the rain, his face unreadable. He watched as the soldiers helped their wounded comrade toward the waiting medics. His eyes, however, were fixed on the cockpit. Major Eva Rostova swung down from the pilot's seat. She moved with a slight stiffness, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade. She did a slow walk around her aircraft, her gloved hand tracing the lines of the fresh damage, her expression that of a rider assessing an injured, beloved horse. Captain Even, leaning on his rifle as a crutch, limped over to Thorne. "Sir," he said, his voice hoarse, "whoever that pilot is, I've never seen anything like it. They flew through hell itself." Thorne just nodded, his gaze still locked on Rostova. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the wet tarmac. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the quiet pilot and her savaged machine. He looked at the faded, barely visible emblem of the owl under her window, and then at the name patch on her chest. A memory surfaced, a story his father, a retired three-star general, used to tell about a ghost pilot in the early days of the Afghan conflict, a pilot who flew solo night missions in a blacked-out bird, a pilot with an almost mythical ability to navigate impossible terrain. A pilot they called Nix. "Rostova?" Thorne said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its earlier authority and anger. "Are you Nix?" Eva Rostova finally looked at him. She didn't smile. She didn't offer any explanation or justification for her actions. She simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A wave of understanding washed over Thorne. He wasn't looking at a disobedient major. He was standing in the presence of a legend. He felt a humbling, profound sense of respect that eclipsed his rank, his experience, his entire worldview. He slowly raised his hand to his brow in a salute, not from a colonel to a major, but from one warrior to another. Captain Even saw the exchange. He straightened up, ignoring the pain in his leg, and rendered his own salute, crisp and formal. His men, seeing their captain, followed suit. A line of battle-hardened Delta Force operators, standing on the rainy tarmac, saluting the quiet, unassuming pilot who had just pulled them back from the dead. Rostova acknowledged them with another brief nod, the highest form of recognition she would ever offer or ask for. Hours later, the storm had finally broken. The last vestiges of the supercell retreated over the eastern mountains, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and washed in the soft, bruised colors of twilight. The air in the hangar was cool and still, thick with the lingering sense of rain, jet fuel, and hot metal. The cacophony of the battle and the storm had been replaced by a deep, resonant silence, punctuated only by the methodical click and scrape of tools. Major Eva Rostova stood on a maintenance scaffold, running a diagnostic cable along a bundle of wires near the main rotor assembly. The official maintenance crew had wanted to quarantine the aircraft, to swarm it for a full damage assessment, but she had quietly insisted on performing the initial inspection herself, with only one assistant. Sergeant Ben Carter worked below, carefully patching a series of bullet holes in the helicopter's belly. There was no conversation between them. None was needed. They moved in a familiar, practiced rhythm, two artisans tending to their wounded creation. The hangar doors were open to the evening air, and Colonel Thorne stood just inside, watching from the shadows. He had spent the afternoon reading Rostova's file. It was a strange, disjointed document. Long periods of unremarkable service punctuated by brief, heavily redacted after-action reports from Special Operations Task Forces. Commendations for valor that were classified above his security clearance. A test pilot for a Black Ops aviation project. A lineage that traced back to a grandfather who flew experimental rocket planes in the Mojave Desert. It was the file of a ghost, a career spent in the seams and shadows of the military. He understood now why she had been so quiet in the briefing, why his dismissal hadn't fazed her. His rules, his authority, his entire frame of reference were irrelevant to her. She operated on a different plane. Rostova finished her check, coiling the cable with practiced efficiency. She paused, her hand resting on the scarred airframe of Styx. She wasn't just touching metal and composites. She was connected to it, feeling the stress fractures, the strained hydraulics, the deep weariness of the machine that mirrored her own. She ran her fingers over the faded owl emblem, its gray eyes seeming to hold the wisdom of 1,000 silent, moonless nights. This machine was her partner, her inheritance, the only thing that truly understood the language of the impossible air she flew through. Carter finished his last patch and began quietly putting his tools away. He looked up at her, silhouetted against the fading light. "Transmission's shot," he said, his voice flat. "She'll need a full replacement. They'll probably want to scrap her." "No," Rostova said, her voice soft but absolute. "We'll rebuild her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Thorne stepped out of the shadows. Rostova and Carter turned to face him, their expressions neutral. Thorne held a freshly printed flight manifest in his hand. He walked over and handed it to Rostova. "Your transport is cleared for departure at 0600, he said. "But your destination has been changed." Rostova looked at the paper. Her new orders weren't to a logistics depot. They were to a classified location, the home of the very Tier 1 unit she had just rescued. It wasn't a punishment for her insubordination. It was a summons. "Captain even made the request personally," Thorne explained. "He said his team would feel better knowing their guardian angel was actually on the payroll." He looked from her to the battered helicopter. "It seems legends are hard to keep grounded." Rostova simply folded the paper and tucked it into a pocket of her flight suit. She gave Thorne a brief, acknowledging nod. It was all the thanks he would get, and it was more than enough. He nodded back and walked away, leaving the pilot and her crew chief alone with their machine. As the last light of day faded, the only sound in the vast hangar was the gentle ticking of the Black Hawk's engines cooling, a sound like a giant's contented sigh. Eva Rostova stood beside it, a silent sentinel, her dignity intact, her legend not spoken, but etched into the scarred metal of the ghost that rode the storm.